The Bank of England did have a view on what Brexit would look like for the UK, and we're now into a session essentially on the advantages, potential advantages of Brexit. Deals with non-EU countries, and this is what the Bank of England said in its monetary policy statement of what economic effect Brexit's already happening and is likely to have. The decision to leave the European Union is having a noticeable impact on the economic outlook. The overshoot of inflation throughout the forecast period predominantly reflects the effects of import prices on the referendum-related fall in sterling. Uncertainties associated with Brexit are weighing on domestic activity, which has slowed even as the global growth has risen significantly. And Brexit-related constraints on investment and labour supply appear to be reinforcing the marked slowdown that has been increasingly evident in recent years in the rate at which the economy can grow without generating inflationary pressures. So I think you can say the Bank of England doesn't think much of Brexit and certainly has been pretty public about it today. But the other thing that's happened today, we know interest rates went up at lunchtime and markets didn't take a blind bit of notice of what the Bank of England said either. So no one on this panel is forced to take the bank necessarily very seriously. We're talking about the advantages of Brexit, what can happen with deals with non-EU countries, and each of the panel will get about 5 minutes to give a brief introduction, and then we will go through topics such as what can you do in the transition period, what negotiations can you have them. One important question, of course, is what happens to deals that the EU already has with third countries when Britain no longer becomes a member, or no longer is a member of the EU in a transition period. That's not an easier subject as some people like to think it is. Now, I'm going to be reasonably strict as a chair. If anyone starts mentioning Ricardo, port, cloth, things like that, I'm going to say, no, come on, it's not the 18th century anymore. We are in the 21st century, so this is going to be different to the Institute for Free Trade type of events. Equally, if people just say, oh, it's all a disaster, there are no benefits possible out there, that will get a frown from me too. Julian Jessop, newly, or not so newly now, at the Institute of Economic Affairs. I'm going to start with you.
Well, thank you, Chris. Am I allowed to mention the Corn Laws? Is that
no?
Okay, right, fine.
Absolutely banned.
Okay, fine. Well, I'm glad I was here for the earlier session, the one in particular we've just had, because I think it did cover much of the ground that we might be touching on in our session. It's also a bit of relief for me. Usually I'm the most optimistic person in the room about Brexit, but I think that's actually trumped by Professor Blake. So unusually I'm not the most pro-Brexit person in the room. That certainly won't be the case on Saturday. My next talk is to be the keynote speaker at the annual conference of the Bruges Group, talking about Brexit. So I think this audience may be very different from the one I'll be getting there. I'm going to touch briefly on the three questions that we had on the agenda. First of all, in terms of what the priorities for the UK should be in thinking about trade relationships with the rest of the world. Here I am perhaps a bit more cautious than Professor Blake. I think the important thing is to protect what we already have. First and foremost, of course, our relationship with the European Union. I think in practice it's going to be next to impossible to have as frictionless a trade deal with the EU in future as we have now. After all, the current arrangement is practically frictionless. So getting some form of comprehensive free trade deal with the rest of the remainder of the European Union would be my top priority. Related to that also, something Chris did mention, protecting the trade agreements we already have with the rest of the world by virtue of our membership of the European Union. Actually, if you tot up the share of trade we do with the European Union and that we do with other third countries with some sort of beneficial arrangement because of our membership of the European Union, it doesn't actually leave quite as much as some people think. So I recognise that's an important challenge. So beyond that, looking at those countries where we don't yet have any relationship similar to that we have with the European Union, I think there's a trade-off here between size and speed. Obviously, the big prizes in the long term are going to be trade deals with the fast-growing developing economies like China and India. But I think in practice, those will take quite a while for any country, whether it's the UK or the EU, to negotiate. So instead, we should focus perhaps on those deals that we can do a bit more quickly with the likes of Australia and New Zealand, countries that are sympathetic to us, other countries in the Commonwealth. Now, I know those are not big economies, doing trade deals with them in its own right is not going to be a game changer. But at least it gets us back into the swing of doing deals, something we've, of course, not been able to do for 30 or 40 years. The other option, of course, is not necessarily to go down the trade deal route, but to go down the unilateral free trade route. And I promise not to mention the Corn Laws or anything like that. I will, though, cite some very good work that was published recently by the Resolution Foundation with help from, I know, Sussex University, putting costs on what it would mean if we were to impose tariffs on our trade with the European Union. And they worked out that the average UK household would be £260 worse off if we did that. But they also worked out that the average UK household would be £130 better off if we dropped tariffs with the rest of the world. And I think that's one of the helpful things about Brexit, is it does shine a light on some of the costs of having the common external tariff and what it means for UK households. I'm aware that there are these arguments that if we do that, we potentially damage UK agriculture or other producer interests. I'm aware also of the bargaining chip argument, but I think if you do put a specific figure on it, like £130 a year, then I think that does really put the onus on the other side to justify why we need to continue these economically very efficient ways of protecting our industry through making consumers, including some of the poorest people in this country, pay more than they have to. The second question is about process. How will negotiations with non-EU countries work while we're negotiating departure from the EU? And there's an obvious legal point here that, as far as I understand it, we can't even negotiate a free trade deal, let alone implement one, until we're free of the shackles of the European Union. I'm not personally sure how big an issue that is. I mean, we can have sort of working groups and discussions around discussions and talks in bars and so on. So I think we can probably get quite a long way along the road towards having a free trade deal even before we actually leave. But maybe there are two more important practical questions. The first is simply the sheer number of trade negotiators that we're going to need, that we're only just starting to recruit. And there's also the perhaps reluctance of third countries to sign deals with us until they know what our relationship is going to be with the rest of the European Union. I think that's a reasonable concern. So I think it will take a while before we do get proper free trade deals in with the rest of the world. Perhaps, again, a bit longer than Professor Blake seems to think. Then the final question is, can deals with other countries offset lost trade with the EU? Can they? Yes. Will they? Not sure. You see, I've touched upon some of the caveats I have already. I'm well aware of the work from people like the National Institute of Economic and Social Research suggesting that our trade with the European Union might fall by 10, 20, 40, even 60% if we change our existing arrangements. To me, those estimates sound too high. I think they sort of fail the common sense test. They rely a lot on gravity models that I could go into a lot more detail, but I think overemphasize the importance of proximity. I also think they assume that we lose all the benefits of previous integration and so on with the European Union, whereas in practice we're probably going to keep the same regulatory structure for a while yet. So I don't think those sorts of numbers are right. But in the short term, at least, I think we will probably have a bigger hit from lost trade with the European Union than we're going to be able to gain from trade with the rest of the world. So in the short term, I think Brexit is a negative. Chris touched on the impact on inflation, on the impact on business investment because of the uncertainty around Europe. So in the short term, it's a challenge, but I think in the long run, through a combination of doing better free trade deals with the rest of the world and some unilateral free trade in the meantime, we can at least end up level and maybe even ahead.
And can I just be, so you said in the long term from some trade deals and from unilateral trade deals, and you think those two are compatible with each other? Because this comes to the bargaining issue you mentioned. Yes, I mean,
on that point, I think with unilateral free trade, you start with those areas where there are things that we don't produce at all. So it's not a question of a negotiating discussion. I mean, why do we have tariffs on imports of oranges and coffee and so on? We get rid of those straight away. Maybe we then move on to those areas where we don't obviously have a comparative advantage, and only last do we look at some of the more vulnerable sectors of manufacturing or agriculture. So it's a phased approach. I think the New Zealand model is a very good one for the long term, but also underlines how painful it can be in the short term. So I wouldn't just lower the barriers willy-nilly on day one. I'd do it more gradually, but that's very much the direction of travel.
That's very helpful. Alan Winters of Sussex University, I'll let you go
Okay, thank you. I was not going to organise my comments quite so neatly as Julian in the three questions we were asked, but I am going to divide the issue up into three parts. There are really three groups of countries that we need to consider. The EU has got free trade agreements with 67, 68 different countries, of which approaching half are economic partnership agreements with developing countries. And those are the first two categories. And then there's a whole pile of new countries, I suppose, the bit of optimism that is compulsory. So what's the story with the existing FTAs? With due respect to David Blake, everyone else in the world has agreed we just drop out. I haven't met a single lawyer who's argued that we actually can continue automatically. We have to ask to roll over. We have to go and ask them, would you like to roll this over? And strictly, we have to do it by the 29th of March 2019. A number of countries suggested that maybe they wouldn't. There's also a question that even if we did roll it over, there are rules of origin to consider. At the moment, they will accept they'll impose zero tariffs on goods which are, roughly speaking, 60% produced in the EU and the UK. Once we split off, there's going to be very few goods where the local content from the UK is 60%, so we wouldn't get the zero tariffs anyway, unless we negotiate a trilateral agreement, the EU, the UK, and the partner. In a world of perfect rationality and neutrality, you might think that's possible, but you know, we're not doing great with the EU. The idea that they're going to turn up in 68 capitals over the next 16 months and negotiate something that suits us and is really of no interest to them is pretty far-fetched. So actually, it's going to be difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. I gather that Dr. Fox admitted yesterday it's not a done deal. It's absolutely not a done deal. Okay, second issue, the developing countries which have economic partnership agreements. My view, it has been since 1997 when they were floated, when Sheila Page wrote a paper telling the EU it would be a disaster, that it would be a disaster, it has been a disaster, and we ought to stop. The government has got a few policies, you'll be surprised to know, in Brexit, one of which is we're going to continue with the EPAs. Goodness me. This really is crazy. These EPAs are just not doing the job that's required. They're not doing it for us. They're not doing it for the developing countries. So there, I think we should just stop the nonsense, and we should have a somewhat more generous unilateral preference scheme. Max Mendes-Para at ODI has actually done quite a lot of the work that suggests you can do this in a way that leaves more or less no developing country worse off. So there's a bit of effort I would save. There are about 30 or so countries we don't have to worry about. We just say we're going to make sure you're no worse off than now. Please let us get on with some of the other stuff. Finally, the new countries. Julian has suggested correctly that maybe Australia and New Zealand will be easier. We can beat them at cricket, so we can beat them at trade negotiation. But actually, it's hardly worth the trouble. You know, the trade between the UK and Australia is very small. They're our 30th smallest partner, largest partner. We are their 10th or something like that. What do they export to us? Lead. The maximum tariff is 6%. Most of them are much lower than that. Gold, no tariff at all. Wine, 5-6%. What do we export to them? I have to say I can't quite recall, except for motor vehicles, where they have a fairly high tariff. But in truth, they're small goods trade, and the restrictions are not very great. That's all right, because they're services partners. Well, it's not quite as easy as that either. More than half the services trade between the UK and Australia in each direction is tourism. There's not a single restriction on tourism that is amenable to treatment in a free trade agreement. The third largest element is transportation. Carting goods from Australia to the UK or carting them back from the UK to Australia. Depends on goods trade. It's not something that's going to be affected by a free trade agreement. They're not going to give us cabotage so that we can send British ships from Perth to Adelaide and so on. The second largest service sector is professional services, and the Australians have said, you know what? Well, we'll need some visas. So it's not going to be easy with the Australians. When you come to the US, they have a template. They believe in hormone-fed beef, they believe in investor-state dispute settlement, and so on. US trade agreements are pretty much part of a package. One is next, much like the last one. That nice Mr. Trump is not going to say, for you, I'll do something really special, or at least not in any meaningful sense. China, I don't think that's going to be very easy. India, neither. So the truth of the matter is, we're going to have to work very hard with a capacity we've barely got to create a whole series of shallow trade agreements that are really basically just going to deal with goods. All they're going to do, even with those goods, is change tariffs a bit. That's a manipulation of the tax system to favour some parties, not others. It doesn't do very much. What are we giving up with the EU? The single market, which has gone a long ways, by a million miles, the deepest arrangement between independent countries for trade, and it has reduced real trading costs. It's reduced the cost of doing trade, not because you no longer pay the tax and the government doesn't get the money, but because you don't waste your time on the border, you don't waste your time with certification, and so on. So we've got to give up, as it were, something that reduces real trade costs for something that, in a sense, just pretends. So the basic point is the FTAs are going to be quite hard. It's not a walkover, even rolling over the old ones, and actually it's probably not going to be worth a great deal anyway. Was that optimistic enough?
Well, it was optimistic. I mean, you can be as optimistic as you like. I mean, I don't think there's no ruling on that. Boris Johnson isn't in the room, I don't think. Policing optimism. So just I want to have one question, just like I did with Julian, from what you said. You talked about the losses from leaving the single market. Now, Julian made the point that Nice's work might, to many people, seem a little bit fantastical in terms of the large scale of losses that they have. Do you also think that when you are putting up the barriers, you might, given that we've had no barriers at all, there will be some losses, but they might not be as large as some people think?
Yeah, I'm certain they won't be as large as some people think, but they'll still be massive. And when I'm offered the choice, well, you can lose 60% of your sales or only 40, oh, well, I think 40 will do. I'll be very happy with that. But actually, that's just silly. Okay, but yeah, that's it.
Okay, so I managed to phrase that question fantastically badly. Do you think the 60 or 40 is a realistic number? You've just used both those numbers.
I think 40 probably is a realistic number. 60 is probably, I mean, it's very uncertain. It's difficult to know. It will take a long time. But yeah, 60 is probably on the high side. 40 feels to me about right.
Okay, so that's good. So at least we know where the panel are standing in sort of pretty concrete terms, and I think that's important before we try and test that. Now, our third speaker, very pleased, is Meredith Crowley, who is from here, the UK and a Changing Europe, and also from Cambridge University. Meredith.
Okay, thank you. So it's a tough act to follow Alan because I agree with so much of what he says that I have to now think, what am I going to say that's a little bit different? So I'll speak as an American a little bit from a perspective of what's going on with American policy, and also want to place, as somebody who's focused a lot on the WTO, place Britain within the world trading system. And so some concerns I have had in the various discussions about what happens after we're outside the EU. And what I hear in the news is that there's a strong desire to negotiate more agreements. And so I take that as meaning that the UK will not stay in the customs union, but it would go forward to negotiate some type of future agreements. So one thing I hear that I think is deeply concerning to me is this idea that the UK is going to go forward and negotiate a bunch of bilateral free trade agreements, and especially this idea that we're going to go negotiate something with Australia and New Zealand, because as Alan said, why do we want to do that? There's nothing you're trading with these countries. And it's not that easy for these negotiators to go forward and even negotiate with an easy country like Australia. And so I think that's potentially very time-consuming for very little gain. And so I think the question is, well, where are the future opportunities here? Now, so one thing I do disagree with Alan about a little bit is this role of deep trade agreements versus shallow trade agreements. And so the EU is a deep trade agreement with a bunch of institutions that creates a whole bunch of favorable systems for businesses, right? So it's very easy to establish your global value chain within the EU because you've got all of this harmonized regulation. I think what we've seen in the last couple of years, though, is a real rejection in a lot of high-income Western countries for international organizations, international treaties, international institutions that don't have the democratic legitimacy that they really need to have. And so I think one of the problems we're having in the United States right now with Trump is that the WTO, in some sense, engaged in a little bit of judicial overreach in various disputes involving the United States, and there was at least one contingent in the U.S. that felt that there was judicial overreach on the part of the WTO, and that constrained the U.S.'s sovereignty in ways they are not happy about. Some of these are legitimate concerns, so it's a question of degree. And so I think maybe one thing that the British population wanted is they're not happy with some of these institutions of the EU, but there's an information disconnect here. Food regulation and all of these standards are not necessarily set in Brussels. Some of these are global standards set by an international standards organization. The amount of fruit and jam, that's a global standard, has nothing to do with the EU. It stands as a classification of a good regardless. So I think what I would think one possible thing to do in the future is for the UK to go forward and join some of these mega regional agreements. So right now, there's not a lot of prospect for progression at the WTO with deeper integration. I think there's been a lot of rejection of some of those ideas. So one thing they could do, if Trump weren't our president, I think it'd be very easy for the UK to go and join NAFTA. It's not clear how much longer he'll be the president, but if that's a problem there with him in NAFTA, another option would be there's some political will on the part of Australia and Japan to go forward with the TPP. And I think that there would be a welcoming of the UK into that. Now, that's a shallower agreement, but it has some provisions that are a little bit deeper. One of the issues at the WTO right now involving the US, China, Argentina, the EU, is that the liberal Western economies are not really happy with state aid on the part of countries like China, efforts to circumvent rules and subsidy and state aid on the part of countries like Argentina, and they would like to have more constraint on the use of state aid. And this has not really been feasible to renegotiate at the WTO, but the Trans-Pacific Partnership establishes rules for state-owned enterprises that would essentially constrain what China is doing. And so this as a mega regional would establish not just a trade regime in which there's a relatively simple rules of origin. You only need to have 35% TPP content for things to move across borders. It would be a large free trade zone. So that potentially is one option. So I think maybe I'd like the UK's future view, for the 20-year horizon to be stepping away from this tedious bilateral agreements that don't really gain anything. I mean, the very simple thing is if the UK goes forward and negotiates with Australia, what do you think Australia is going to say when they're going to say, well, we want market access to sell lamb in the UK, and the US they're going to say, but you're going to turn around tomorrow and then negotiate this with the US, and we're going to lose all that market access to the US. So I think some of these countries have the same interests in what they think they can get out of the UK, and so trying to negotiate a series of bilaterals isn't going to be very valuable. You need to just go in, bring all the partners together, and have like a multilateral agreement.
Thank you very much. And just a quick question on your idea of, which seems to be quite current at the moment, of Britain joining NAFTA. I think I first read it in Stephen King's book, in the postscript to Stephen King's new book, Grave New World, which was a dystopia about the future, and his postscript was an imagination forward to about 2044, in which we had joined the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, and now it's seen as a bit of a utopian idea. So how do you see us joining a mega trade structure like NAFTA or TPP? How would that interact with whatever deal we would want to be able to do with Europe?
Well, so the European relationship is incredibly important to the UK. That's got to be the priority, maintaining that frequent market access. The global value chains of manufacturing are oriented toward Europe, but I have no idea what's going to happen there. They cannot give up that as much market access as they can get in Europe. That's got to be the priority, absolutely. But then the question is, lots of countries are, parts of these mega regional agreements. It complicates things, right? But this idea of we want to go forward and have greater trade. NAFTA is a bit of a disaster at the moment, right? We don't even know if it's going to survive the year. But in terms of looking forward, it's sort of a question, I think from my view, it's more of once we settle the EU question, which should be the top priority, then what's the next thing you do? And I don't want to see people going to Australia and negotiating some sort of bilateral. It makes a lot more sense right now to be planning a larger agreement with a large set of countries. I think one of the rejections, from my perspective, is maybe there is this rejection of ideas of European regulation for some things like food safety standards. They are more restrictive than the US. And I personally enjoy them, having lived in both countries. But I can see that they do raise costs for some parts of the population within Europe. And if people want, I mean, there's also this question about production versus consumption standards. I mean, the US produces lots of stuff we sell in other parts of the world that we can't consume in our own country, like, DDT. We also produce some things for export to countries like Japan, which have higher standards for certain food products. So it's not entirely clear to me what the best thing is there, but I have this sense of like the UK, and as I think maybe Thomas mentioned earlier when he was talking about OECD standards of regulation, the UK is a more liberal system in terms of regulation. In the UK, I mean the US and Canada, Australia, they mirror that liberality with regard to regulation that's not a feature of continental Europe. So I think that there is the scope for that type
So your priority would be sort out the relationship with the EU first, and then a mega regional.
Yeah.
But not New Zealand.
It's just got to be done together. You need to get a bunch of countries. It's silly to do one by one.
Okay, so one of the things, let's cast, we've got another however many months we have before March 30th, 2019, to get quite a lot in place in terms of our future relationship. So assuming we leave on that day, leave the EU, Alan's already touched on the point of what do we do with the 68 agreements we have with third-party or other countries. There are many, many more agreements we have. I think the FT counted them up of 975 or something like that. Treaties that the EU have, which have some form of trade aspect to them with third countries. I just want to ask the panel, what do we have to do in the next 15, 18 months to those aspects? And does that mean that we have to do things now to stop our trade with third countries actually being gummed up on Brexit Day itself? Alan, do you want to take that?
I think the first thing to do is try and move the goalposts. I think a transition period is absolutely essential because we have really rather little negotiating capacity, even less negotiating experience. We've all agreed, I think, that getting the EU relationship right is the most important, and therefore, frankly, all of this other stuff is just not going to get done over 17 months. So I think...
do all of these other agreements fall on Brexit?
No, probably not. Whether it falls or not depends whether Britain signed as... so, for instance, our membership of the WTO does not fall. We signed as a sovereign nation.
So customs cooperation with the US, for example, that's an EU agreement.
If that's an EU agreement, then it probably falls.
And so what do we have to do? I mean, let's just get into the practicalities. We want to have customs cooperation with the US. There's no one in this country wouldn't want that. What do we have to do now?
I confess that I don't know about specific relationships, but my guess is that for a cooperation agreement like that, we would need basically to negotiate with the US to reassure them that we would be able to continue to behave in the way that they had expected when they signed up with the EU as part of our membership. So it wouldn't just be a matter of rolling up and saying sign here. We would need to put something in behind it to guarantee to them that, as it were, we could honour our side of the bargain. It probably shouldn't be too complicated.
Meredith, do you think that would be easy to do with the Trump administration?
So I think the Trump administration, I see their trade policy as a bit bipolar. So on the one hand, There's a president who I would say is uninformed, ignorant, and doesn't have a clear goal for what the country should be trying to do. And there's this, but not all of his economic policy guys are fall into that camp. So I would say I have very strong disagreements with the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, but he's not an ignorant or uninformed person. I think he has well-formed opinions for where U.S. trade policy should be going. I don't think his opinions line up perfectly with the president's, but he has some, a lot of what he says I disagree with, but he has some legitimate concerns about U.S. sovereignty and about, specifically I raised this about the WTO earlier. So I think there are many parts of the United States government that continue to function very well, even with a bad president. And so this is something the U.S. Congress wants to trade with Britain. I mean, somebody was telling me that, so I don't think that technical relationships are going to be very difficult to sort out. This is something, you just bring people from the State Department or USTR. They'll sit down. I think the U.S. feels, very positively toward Britain in general. Even Trump probably does more so than other countries.
So we phone up USTR and we just ask.
You just say, we want customs facilitation. Is that workable? And they'll say, of course it is. The U.S. is the U.S. is Britain's top export market. So the EU as a whole is much more important to Britain. But as an individual country, the U.S. is very important. But the U.S. is Britain's number 2 partner, I think. It's like the U.S. and Germany and China are all on the top as individual countries. So the U.S. wants to sell stuff here. So I don't think this is, they'd like customs to work smoothly too.
And Julian, are you worried about any, not necessarily that deals won't be done, because I think we just heard that there is definitively an incentive on both sides to at least get close to the current treaty agreements we have with third-party countries. But do you think is the British government in a position to be able to get this done in the next 13, 14 months, or are we functional enough, or will things fall through the cracks?
Well, I to be honest, I'm nervous about this. Every time I've looked at any individual agreement, I think this is easy. It's fixable. If we take the Project Fear story that planes are going to stop flying, for example, that's easily and obviously fixable. If we take the idea that NHS patients are going to be denied cancer-saving drugs because of us leaving the European Union, again, a Project Fear story, that's easily fixable if the political will is there, and I'm sure it would be. The problem is the sheer number of these agreements that have to be done. Even if we fix 90% of them in the next 18 months or so, that still leaves 10% of potentially very, very important things that we haven't fixed. So I would very much agree with Professor Winters. What we need is a transition period to give us that extra time. If we do have a 2-year transition period, for example, that gives us basically 3.5 years from now to sort out all these details. So I do think it's doable. If it is doable, though, this is where I think that the no-deal idea actually has at least some merit. If we decided sooner rather than later that actually we're not going to get very far on negotiations around a single market and a customs union agreement, then at least we can give businesses the clarity that they want to say that we're leaving the single market and the customs union in March 2019, and they can kick in with their contingency plans and so on. But even then, that leaves a whole host of other things that will need fixing. So even that is only a partial solution. So I think overwhelmingly the best outcome here is not a no deal, whichever caveats you put around that term. It's some form of transitional agreement leading to a comprehensive free trade deal at the end of it. No deal does worry me, perhaps not as much as most people, but it's clearly a second best.
Alan wants to come in here for a second, but I've also got another question for anyone on the panel, just following up precisely on that. What sort of transition agreement do we have? Is it a sort of Phil Hammond standstill transition agreement? Is it a Theresa May implementation of a new agreement? Is it a prolongation of the acquis, because that's the only way you can actually have a standstill and actually do all these things?
Well, a lot of that is down to the terminology and the politics. I think I would in effect be looking for a standstill agreement in the sense that we keep all the benefits. But also politically, of course, we need to avoid some of the obligations. And I recognise that's almost an impossible juggling act. I think, for example, it would be very hard for the British public to accept the idea of continued sovereignty of the European Court of Justice, which I suspect might be a condition for many of the benefits that we could gain from that. So I'm afraid I simply don't have an answer to that. It'll be decided by politicians and lawyers. But For me, a standstill agreement that protected the economic benefits is the obvious thing to get. Will we be offered that? Quite possibly not.
And is the alternative to ask to stay in for longer, or is that just out of the question?
Well, again, the political dangers here, because obviously the longer that we stay in one form or another, the greater the risk, as I would see it, that a transitional arrangement becomes permanent, maybe because of a change in government or whatever it might be, and we end up not leaving the European Union at all. Now, I know many people might think that's an optimal solution, but it's not necessarily what people voted for the last time they had a chance.
Alan, you wanted to come in on two issues.
Yes,
here.
just a very brief point about negotiating these small agreements. Every time Britain turns up in some capital saying, please can we sign this, you're opening yourself up for a quid pro quo. And the idea that with 759 agreements, there won't be at least someone who says, well, okay, sure, we could do that, but, that lamb quota, we see this linkage all the time. So that is also going to be a complication, and that means you get spillover from one to the next. On the transition, I've got a really well-defined view on this. My belief is there is only one transition that sort of offers you a standstill that is technically possible, and that is extending Article 50. The idea that we can write the whole of the acquis into law and make it binding, including, by the way, getting an extension of all the agreements we have with third countries by March 2019, and that the EU would say, that's all right, no, fine, all that trouble, it's 2 years, no, if that's what you want, you have it. It just seems to me to be absolutely wild. So I perfectly see the huge political problem that poses in Westminster. But frankly, I think this is the point at which realism will kick in. Everybody in the cabinet, it seems, has basically agreed that we need a basically status quo transition. And I really do believe that there is only one way of doing it. And eventually, my prediction is that we will find some way of trying to do the politics to assure Julian and his sort of co-travellers that indeed we will really leave, and then extend Article 50.
How do you get there? Because put yourself in Theresa May's shoes. She was not, as far as we know, a supporter of Brexit, but she wants to enact the referendum's decision. She's got a pretty difficult balancing act within her cabinet, an even harder one within Parliament, as we saw yesterday. Do you just have to wait until the trade-off is so clear that everyone sees it, or is leadership in some sense needed?
Well, leadership, I think, would be nice, but essentially, it seems to me that what I'm suggesting is that we will need some more direct evidence that it can't happen. But eventually, you see, I think that Mrs. May's trade-off would be a chaotic hard Brexit versus extending Article 50. And then she'll see, look, actually, I have to say, I think the Conservative Party is screwed more or less whichever way it goes now. I mean, either they don't get Brexit, which is political failure, or they do, and the economics will be very horrible. But that's, I think she will confront the issue with sort of falling investment, perhaps one or two large companies leaving, disruption within the House of Commons, and, in a sense, the only thing that keeps the show on the road for a bit longer is to say, deep breath. Actually, we never had a date in the referendum. Several European institutions have suggested that extending Article 50 would be possible, and that's what you'd have to do. Hold on and do it.
But let me just come back to it, because you see, there you're saying that at some point the trade-off becomes unavoidable. But we've just heard from Julian that where you talk about planes not flying or nuclear isotopes not coming into the country, that's will be seen as Project Fear, and in a chaotic Brexit that wouldn't happen. But we can also see quite his point that these agreements should be able to be made. When does this happen? When do you get to the point that we actually have to face these trade-offs? Because I think well, I'm going to actually make a comment now. I don't think we're going to see in the next year a sudden economic calamity that brings everyone to their senses, a type of moment that it's the economy that will hit. I think it's going to be politics.
Well, my feeling is that we are actually pretty close to a tipping point. We know from our conversations with people in industry, financial services and so on, that if something isn't announced soon or isn't some clarity soon, we're talking months, maybe even weeks in some cases, then we will see the contingency plans implemented. We will see investment drying up. I think the clock is ticking here. If we don't get a positive decision at the EU summit in December, some clarity that we're moving to some form of trade talks and some idea of what's at the end of those trade talks, then I think the UK will then at that point be faced with a choice. Do we go for no deal, in whichever way you want to describe it, or do we effectively, not quite chuck in the towel, but do we go for an extension which is allowed for under Article 50 and recognise it will take a bit longer to do? I do think the latter is extremely hard to sell to the British public, but perhaps not impossible. As was said, there wasn't a timetable in the referendum. From my point of view, as long as we've left, say, in 5 or 10 years, exactly how we've got there and how long it's taken us is secondary to where we actually end up. So, for me at least, I'll be satisfied with the idea of a transition as long as I know that the end point is leaving the European Union. Extremely difficult politically, though, obviously.
Okay, so we've got to the point where we think transition is difficult. I'm going to open it up to the floor very soon. There are advantages in free trade agreements in goods out there. And just before I open it up to the floor, I want to raise the subject of services, since that is, I was in the US last month in October with the Chancellor, just before he ballsed up and said the EU was our enemy. He gave some very good answers on why he was out there trying to talk about services with other countries, and that was what his message was supposed to be that day. Does Britain have a serious opportunities in services around the world, and with whom? I'll open up to the whole panel. Meredith, I'll go to you first.
So I'm not a services expert, but an observation is that when Hong Kong reunited with China, there was this view in Hong Kong that financial services would remain forever in Hong Kong as this place with this liberal tradition, and that they would never move into Shanghai, and they have. So I think this is one of the, when we think about London relative to the EU, if EU wants to grab a lot of this financial services business, I think they've a strong incentive to, and I think it won't happen quickly, but it could happen gradually. I think one of the things is financial services can be very lucrative, and firms don't necessarily like competition. So the question is, are the existing firms within a country like the United States or within a big market like China or a big market like Brazil, are they open to liberalizing their market? I mean, you've got very strong vested interests there. And while there might be firms in some of these countries that would benefit from more efficient financial service provision, so manufacturers or other types of firms would like more efficient financial service provision. I think there's very strong entrenched interests in many of these countries that are going to fight tooth and nail to keep their services markets as closed as they can. So I think that's going to be a tough battle.
Julian, where do you see the opportunities in services?
Well, I tend to look at this from first principles of various old, dead, white economists whose name I can't mention from the 18th and 19th century. The key principle here is comparative advantage. It's not necessarily a question of us as a country being better than, for example, China or India at producing a certain good or service. It's simply that we should specialise at whatever we do best compared to what the alternatives that we might specialise in are. There's concerns earlier, I heard Ian Dunt talking about the threat to agriculture or low-end manufacturing. It's not clear to me that necessarily should be the future of the UK, to focus on things like low-end manufacturing. If we do continue to hollow out manufacturing jobs to China, fair enough. We can move on to other things. Exactly what they are, actually, I don't know. I mean, the world is changing all the time. New industries are developing all the time. I think there's a danger of taking a sort of protectionist perspective, that you look at what you've already got and assume that that is what you need to protect, rather than, in effect, let market forces decide. Liberalise the economy. Throw the cards up in the air, see where they land. You will need some transitional arrangements to protect the losers from that, but we've got all sorts of ways of doing that through the welfare system and so on and so on. If, for example, we want to continue subsidising farmers, let's do so for what we want them to be, which is guardians of the environment. You know, if they, rather than using what is in effect a tax on consumers to pay higher prices for agricultural products than we would otherwise have done. I don't have a particularly strong answer for where our specialisations will be in 10, 20, 30 years' time. My answer, though, might sound weak to you. Let the market decide.
There are very likely some services where we will be able to negotiate some access, but we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that it's easy or quick. One of the reasons actually for not giving away all the tariffs on goods at the moment is precisely that is the sort of leverage that might encourage some countries to negotiate with us on services. One of the big problems with services, they're all different. They don't belong to the trade ministry, they belong to these other ministries which don't terribly much sort of take to international trade in the same sort of way, and they are also, most of them, in the hands of the elites of these countries. I worked a lot on the creation of the single market, and I once chaired a meeting between veterinary experts about harmonising European veterinary. So this descended more or less into a fist fight. The issue is that it's extremely difficult. It's not quite like persuading coal miners that you're going to throw them out of work. You are dealing with people who are extremely articulate, extremely well connected. So services is very hard work. Countries like China want to expand their own services. They're not willing, in a sense, to run the risk that they're stifled by opening up to Britain wholesale. So I think it's feasible, and I think Julian is exactly right. We can't really tell, but it will just be a very long process.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan and the panel. Questions? Right at the back. Phil McCann.
Philip McCann, University of Sheffield. It's just a comment because it helps us understand the magnitude of what we're talking about. From the World Impact Output Database, I was talking about it earlier, the EU economy, its impact on the UK is just under half the size of the London economy, and about 2/3 of the size of the whole of the South East economy. The United States is about the same as the economy of Greater Manchester. China, that we talk about, is about the same as the West of England Combined Authority, Bristol and Bath. Australia, Canada are each about the same size as the Bournemouth economy. India is about the same size as Blackpool and the Fylde Coast of St Anne, Lytham, St Anne's and Fleetwood. And finally, New Zealand is about the same size as the economy of Chesterfield.
That is what you're saying, that is in their importance to the UK economy at the moment.
At the moment.
At the moment.
How much? Because we don't have trade deals with them.
Julian, how much could New Zealand, it's Chesterfield at the moment, what would it become?
Well, it is a very fair point. I hope I made clear in my comments, I think in the short run it's difficult to see the UK coming out ahead. The European market is simply so important to us, and there are so many barriers that need to be cleared before we can do meaningfully larger amounts of trade with the rest of the world, that I think realistically in the short run we will be worse off as a result of this. Perhaps the trickier question is in 10, 20, 30 years' time will we be better off? And there are two things there. One is that, of course, China and India and all those other countries will be a lot bigger. We know that they're going to be continuing to grow much faster than the European Union, so the potential market there is bigger. Against that, though, there's the counterfactual. Would we have been better remaining part of the European Union and waiting for the European Union to do a trade deal with these countries, or can we do better in the meantime ourselves? And there are arguments here on both sides. I mean, some people say that we're going to be a less attractive market as a potential negotiating partner because we're smaller. To which I'd counter, we're actually still pretty big, 5th or 6th biggest economy in the world. And it may well be that we're going to be a more nimble negotiating partner because we're one country rather than negotiating on behalf of 27 plus various regional parliaments. So there's a trade-off here. I'm not sure which way it will go. I mean, I would hope to argue that it will work in our favour, but equally, I'm not going to be Panglossian about this. I mean, there are serious dangers that we're worse off in the short run, and that short run becomes longer and longer.
Right at the front here. And if you could also say your name and any affiliation.
Sam Lowe, Friends of the Earth. My question is about the transition in relation to the replication of existing arrangements, because I agree with Alan that the only way that they continue in the transition is if you extend Article 50. But if I'm going to put forward a scenario to you where I think we lose a lot of leverage, and I also know DIT are worried about it, if according to the EU, in order to negotiate with them, we have to be outside of the common commercial policy. That's at least what Malmstrom has said. So therefore, even if we go into a customs union and single market arrangement in the interim, we fall off a cliff in regards to third-party relationships on day one still. Therefore, but those existing countries still have access to our markets on the terms that currently exist, at least for goods, because we are still applying the EU's common external tariff. Is there a scenario where the countries with existing agreements use that as leverage for further concessions so as to avoid a scenario where they leverage the scenario that essentially their exporters continue on the terms that exist and ours lose out? Sorry, there's a lot in that. But
I'm going to give that to Alan.
Okay. I'm not sure that I accept that that once we're on the outside, that we are obliged to continue zero tariff access for them.
if we were in a customs union
if we did a Turkey, yes, sure. No. The whole problem with Turkey is that it accepts the EU's common external tariff but doesn't benefit from its negotiating muscle, and that would be a situation that we would get into. But joining a customs union with the EU, as opposed to remaining within Article 50 and being a member of the customs union, are different. So I think it is clearly a question that we absolutely should not think there are any automatic solutions to these FTAs with external partners. We really do have to negotiate them. I should say one of the things that despite what Cecilia Malmstrom has said, it seems to me that once we have advanced negotiations a little bit and we've got sort of, in a sense, into a constructive mode on them, I actually believe that the EU would say, look, we understand you understand you can't sign, but actually it would just be churlish of us to stop you from negotiating. At the moment there's a game being played. They think that by preventing it, in a sense, they're putting pressure on us. But once they've accepted that it really is going to happen, then it seems to me the EU gets very little out of, as it were, trying to enforce, quite how it would do so, I don't know, but trying to enforce. We can't talk to other countries. So it seems to me we could get a very substantial part of a negotiation done actually prior to Brexit Day, once we've entered constructive negotiations with the EU.
Yeah, so coming on the bargaining point argument, I think it's something you were touching on, the idea that if we unilaterally lower our tariffs, we're throwing away a bargaining card. I think there is something in that, but unilateralism does have this appeal to me. If we go ahead and lower our tariff barriers and our consumers are demonstrably better off as a result, and we're also able to compensate the losers so the economy as a whole is better off, then I think, to use the phrase, we are acting as a champion or a beacon of free trade. Other countries will then follow. That, to me, sounds preferable to an alternative of starting from a position where we don't have tariff barriers with the European Union, effectively charging UK households £260 a year more than they're currently paying, and saying to them, well, we need this as a bargaining chip and also to protect the farmers down the road. I think unilateralism actually would be a better alternative than that.
Right at the back there.
Thank you. Ian Morling, Winchester Partners. Ivan Rogers, in his evidence to the Treasury Select Committee last week, said that the Brits have got it wrong in the sense that all the European Union is willing to offer is a deep, comprehensive free trade agreement. So we're starting from a baseline which is very low. It's not EEA or even EEA minus. And he pointed out, and most, I think, commentators before and since have said that that's going to take years. So business, I think I would agree with Julian, is definitely getting extremely concerned. The best solution would be for our government to recognize the fact that to get a complete, deep, comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union by the 29th of March of 2019, is highly improbable, and therefore a framework agreement has to be agreed, a heads of terms. And then, either, as Alan says, to extend the Article 50 period, or at least to have something which is in fact an extended negotiation period, which might not be exactly the same thing. But the true problem of all of this is that business, financial services, investors, by definition will have only the certainty of a framework agreement, which is fundamentally an agreement to agree, a letter of intent, and cannot be binding until all the different bits of a deep comprehensive free trade agreement have been agreed, which could take 5 to 10 years if we take the example. So that seems to be the most coherent, logical situation as of today. What does the panel think?
Okay, Meredith, I'm going to ask you whether you think that is the most logical, coherent picture.
So I think the business investment position should be very worrying to all of us. I think one of the things I'll raise is we earlier saw a number of papers talking about the costs of UK's exit from the EU. And a point I'll make is that most of these economic models, and I might be wrong about some of the details, but typically the way we do gravity models of trade is we look at small changes in taxes and we see the impact they have on trade flows, and then we quantify the impact on GDP. What these generally omit is an analysis of investment flows. And so we do know from going back to the United States in the 1980s, the US put on very high tariffs on automobiles because they were unhappy with imports from Japan. And the Japanese responded very quickly by relocating their production to within the United States. And that sort of system evolved, and that's what we basically have. Most cars in the United States are Japanese cars that Americans drive are produced within the United States, even though today the US import tariff on automobiles is only 2.5%. So I think that one of the costs that we're just not paying attention to is the risk of investment leaving the UK gradually or quickly and moving into the European Union to take advantage of these beneficial global value chains. And that, it's not clear to me that firms are going to pick up before March of 2019, but I think this concern they have, they don't know what's going to happen. If it's time to build your next plant, you're not going to build it here if you don't know what the hell's going to happen in the next 5 years. So I think that is a risk, and it's something that we're not paying enough attention to.
Okay, any other questions? We are out of time, I'm being told. So I'm just going to wrap up with a slightly provocative statement, which is that in modern economics, there's a sort of a new view of trade, which is coming out from people like Danny Roderick in the US, which is that economists have often oversold the benefits of free trade agreements and trade liberalization, because losers are never compensated in modern economies. We always talk about having great compensation mechanisms, and they never happen. So losers lose badly, winners don't gain that much. And then there's a big but. But you would never reverse the trade agreements you've already done, because that would create a new set of losers, and would be worse overall in aggregate. So just as a thought, what we might be doing in Brexit is the worst of all worlds, where we set out for new free trade agreements that create a whole bunch of losers among farmers who will complain and dump a lot of manure around London, with the gainers about £100 a year better off not really noticing it. And we will put up barriers with the EU and lose there again. Anyway, just wanted to leave you with that possible thought. Thank you very much.